He watched from the porch of his small wooden house a girl who used to walk through the dusty streets of the quiet town of Redemption Creek, Arizona. It was 1882, and that 8-year-old child carried a water bucket 3 times larger than herself, staggering under the weight, while the scorching desert sun punished her delicate skin. Jake Morrison wasn't a man to meddle in other people's business. A Civil War veteran, he had arrived in Redemption Creek 2 years ago, seeking peace and quiet, to heal the wounds the war had left on his soul. His calloused hands told stories of bloody battles at Gettysburg, Antietam, and Bull Run. Each scar on his body was a reminder of the horrors he had witnessed when men killed each other for ideals that now seemed distant and empty. The house where he lived was simple, built with his own hands using wood from the nearby mountains. 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and the porch where he spent afternoons watching life go by. He had bought the land with money from his military pension, a modest amount that allowed him to live without luxuries, but with dignity. His only valuable possessions were a Colt .45 that he never failed to clean religiously every night, and a faded photograph of a golden-haired woman he had lost during the war. But there was something about that girl that deeply troubled him, something that awakened an old rage in his chest, a fury he had tried to bury along with the memories of battlefields. The child's name was Mary Sullivan, an orphan since a mysterious fever took her parents the previous winter. The disease had arrived in Redemption Creek like a biblical plague, killing dozens of people within weeks. The Sullivans were found dead in their small cabin on the outskirts of town, embracing each other as if trying to protect one another until the last moment. Mary had survived hidden in the barn, feeding on corn meant for horses and drinking rainwater collected in old buckets. Now she lived under the care of Ezra Blackwood, the richest and most powerful man in Redemption Creek. Blackwood owned the silver mine, the bank, most of the land, and practically every soul in that god-forsaken town. He had arrived 5 years earlier, when the first silver veins were discovered in the nearby mountains. Since then, he had systematically bought, intimidated, or eliminated any competition, transforming a prosperous mining community into his personal kingdom of terror. Jake knew something was deeply wrong, very wrong. There were signs everywhere for those who knew where to look. Men disappeared during the night without leaving traces. Entire families abandoned their homes overnight, leaving behind all their belongings. The former sheriff had died under mysterious circumstances, just 3 months after publicly questioning some of Blackwood's business practices. The silver mine produced impressive quantities of the precious metal, but no one in town seemed to be getting rich, except Blackwood and his henchmen. The miners worked long hours for miserable wages, living in overcrowded barracks that looked more like prisons. Those who complained about working conditions had strange accidents or simply disappeared. Blackwood's bank lent money at exorbitant interest rates, and when debtors couldn't pay, they lost their properties in fraudulent auctions where only Blackwood's men made bids. In 2 years, he had acquired more than half the land around town through these questionable methods. That September morning, while watching Mary stumble and spill half the water, Jake made a decision that would change everything. There was something in the way the girl constantly looked over her shoulder, as if expecting to be attacked at any moment. Her movements were those of a wounded animal, cautious and full of fear. Jake descended the creaking wooden steps and walked toward the girl. Each step raised a small cloud of red dust that stuck to his worn boots. The sun was high and merciless, creating hard shadows that cut through the main street like razors. When he approached Mary, he could clearly see the signs of abuse: purple marks on her thin arms, a poorly healed cut on her lower lip, and something even worse in her eyes. That empty expression he had seen on the faces of soldiers who had witnessed too many horrors for their young minds to process. He offered help with the bucket, but Mary instinctively recoiled, her blue eyes wide with pure terror. Her words came out in a trembling whisper, revealing that Blackwood had threatened to punish her if anyone tried to help her. When she lowered her eyes and Jake saw the rope marks on her delicate wrists, he felt a fury he hadn't experienced since the bloodiest days of the war. At that moment, Jake Morrison understood he had found his new enemy, and this time, there would be no rules of engagement or military codes to restrict his actions. Ezra Blackwood wasn't just a successful businessman, he was a predator who fed on others' suffering, a parasite who had infected Redemption Creek like a disease. His 2-story mansion dominated the town from atop a hill, its windows always lit during the night like vigilant eyes that never slept. The property was surrounded by a high wrought iron fence with gates that remained locked and guarded 24 hours a day. Well-maintained gardens contrasted grotesquely with the misery he spread throughout the town. Ornamental fountains gushed crystal-clear water, while the orphaned children under his care barely had enough to drink. Blackwood had arrived in Redemption Creek with impressive credentials and a carefully constructed story. He claimed to be an investor from San Francisco who had made his fortune in the Oriental spice trade. He brought letters of recommendation from respectable bankers and spoke with the eloquence of a man educated in the finest Eastern schools. But Jake had learned during the war to recognize human predators, regardless of how well-dressed or educated they were. There was something in Blackwood's eyes, a calculating coldness that revealed the complete absence of empathy or remorse. It was the look of a man who saw other human beings as pieces on a chessboard, useful only as long as they served his purposes. Blackwood's right-hand man was a man named Silas Crawford, known on the streets as the Reaper. Crawford had arrived in town 6 months after Blackwood, emerging from the desert like a sinister apparition mounted on a black horse. His clothes were always impeccable, but they couldn't hide the aura of violence that surrounded him like an invisible cloak. Crawford was a hired killer who had fled Texas after massacring an entire family for $15. The story went that he had invaded the Thompson house during the night, first killing the father with a shot to the chest, then the mother when she tried to protect the children. The children, 2 girls aged 6 and 8, were found days later in an abandoned well on the outskirts of the property. His eyes were cold as mountain winter, and his hands never trembled when pulling the trigger. Crawford had killed at least 20 men in official duels and countless others under less honorable circumstances. He carried 2 Colt .45s with ivory grips engraved with skulls, and it was said he slept with a hunting knife under his pillow. Jake knew that confronting Blackwood meant confronting Crawford, and confronting Crawford meant certain death for most men. But Jake Morrison wasn't most men. He had survived Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, where he saw thousands of men die in a matter of minutes. He had fought hand-to-hand in the trenches of Petersburg, where death came in every imaginable form. 3 days after the encounter with Mary, Jake was in the local saloon when he heard a conversation that chilled his blood to the bone. 2 of Blackwood's henchmen, men he recognized as former convicts, were discussing a special shipment that would arrive the following week. The saloon was a sordid establishment called the Broken Wheel, with walls stained by cigarette smoke and floors covered with sawdust that absorbed blood from frequent confrontations. The bartender was a fat, sweaty man named Pete, who served watered-down whiskey and turned a blind eye to the illegal activities that took place in his establishment. Jake was sitting at a corner table, pretending to read an old newspaper while carefully listening to the conversations around him. He had learned during the war that information was more valuable than gold, and that men talked too much when they thought no one was paying attention. The 2 henchmen, a short, fat man named Rusty and another tall, thin one known only as Snake, were drinking heavily and speaking in voices they thought were low. But Jake had ears trained to catch whispers on noisy battlefields. Rusty mentioned that the boss was especially excited about the new shipment, which would be different from previous ones. Snake laughed in a way that made Jake feel nauseous, explaining that young girls brought much better prices in the Northern Territories. They talked about ages, about how to break the resistance of the more stubborn ones, about methods to keep the merchandise in good condition during transport. Jake almost choked on his whiskey when he fully understood what he was hearing. Blackwood wasn't just exploiting orphans for slave labor. He was selling children to prostitution networks that spread throughout the still unorganized territories of the West. The revelation hit Jake like a punch to the stomach. During the war, he had seen men commit unimaginable atrocities, but always in the heat of battle, driven by fear, anger, or desperation. This was different. This was pure evil, calculated and systematic. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He sat on the porch, obsessively cleaning his Colt while planning his next move. He knew he needed concrete evidence before acting. Accusations without proof would mean nothing against a man of Blackwood's power and influence. He decided to investigate on his own. Over the next few days, he discreetly followed the movements of Blackwood's men, mapping their routes and schedules. He discovered they maintained a secret depot in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, where they stored supplies they didn't want seen publicly. On the night of the new moon, Jake broke into the warehouse. What he found there confirmed his worst fears and revealed even greater horrors. Documents detailed a trafficking operation that extended across 3 states and 2 territories. There were lists of names, ages, physical descriptions, and market prices for dozens of children. Mary Sullivan was marked for shipment the following week. with a special note indicating that her angelic appearance made her especially valuable to specific clients in the luxury brothels of Denver and San Francisco. But that wasn't all. Jake found correspondence revealing connections with corrupt politicians, bought judges, and military officers who turned a blind eye to the operations in exchange for regular payments. Blackwood's network was much larger and more powerful than he had imagined. There were also financial records showing that the silver mine was just a facade. Blackwood's true source of wealth came from human trafficking, arms smuggling, and a counterfeiting operation that operated in the basement of his mansion. He had transformed Redemption Creek into the center of a criminal empire that spread throughout the territory. Jake mentally photographed each document, each name, each detail that could be used as evidence. But he knew that even with all this proof, it would be difficult to find honest authorities willing to confront a man of Blackwood's power. That's when fate brought Samuel Garrett to Redemption Creek. Garrett was the new sheriff, sent by the territorial government after multiple complaints about local corruption. He had arrived on a dusty stagecoach one October afternoon, carrying only a worn leather suitcase and a reputation that preceded him like a storm. Tall and thin as a stick, with a graying mustache and eyes that seemed to see through men's lies, Garrett had the appearance of someone who had seen too much and survived to tell the story. His clothes were simple but well-maintained, and he carried a Colt .44 that showed signs of frequent use but was impeccably maintained. Garrett had been sheriff in Tombstone during the worst years, when the town was a cauldron of violence, where men died every night for reasons ranging from gambling debts to misinterpreted glances. He had faced the Clanton brothers, survived the gunfight at the OK Corral, and maintained peace in a town where the law was often decided at gunpoint. His arrival in Redemption Creek didn't go unnoticed. Blackwood sent Crawford to welcome the new sheriff, a greeting that was both a test and a veiled threat. But Garrett wasn't intimidated. He looked Crawford in the eyes without blinking and made it clear he wouldn't be bought, intimidated, or eliminated easily. When Jake approached Garrett with the evidence he had collected, the sheriff listened in silence, studying each document with the attention of a man who had learned to distinguish truth from lies through years of experience. His questions were precise and revealed a sharp mind that quickly understood the implications of what he was seeing. Garrett confirmed he had received specific orders to investigate Blackwood's activities, but his superiors had been vague about the details. Now he understood why. The corruption reached the highest levels of territorial government, and there were powerful people who preferred to keep Blackwood's crimes secret. Together, Jake and Garrett began planning a strategy to expose and destroy Blackwood's operation. They knew it would be dangerous. Men had died for much less than what they were trying to do, but they also knew it was the right thing to do, regardless of personal consequences. The next morning, Jake woke to screams coming from the direction of Blackwood's mansion. The sound was sharp and desperate, cutting through the morning air like a blade. He dressed quickly, grabbed his weapon and ran to investigate, his heart beating like a war drum. What he saw when he reached the mansion gate made him stop in the middle of the street, bile rising in his throat. Mary Sullivan was hanging by her wrists from a tree in the mansion's yard, while Crawford whipped her with a braided leather whip. Each blow left a red mark on the girl's delicate back, and her torn dress was stained with blood. The girl wasn't screaming anymore. She had fainted from pain, her small body swaying like a rag doll with each crack of the whip. Crawford seemed to be enjoying himself, a sadistic smile twisting his lips as he prepared another blow. Jake didn't think. He just acted. He jumped the wooden fence with the agility of a man half his age and threw himself at Crawford like a wild animal. The impact knocked both men to the ground, and they rolled in the dirt, fighting for possession of the whip. Crawford was younger and faster, but Jake had something the assassin didn't have, a righteous fury that burned like liquid fire in his veins. Each punch he threw carried years of repressed anger, not just for the current situation, but for all the injustices he had witnessed and failed to prevent. Jake's fist met Crawford's nose with a satisfying crack. Blood gushed like a red fountain while the assassin staggered backward, trying to clear his eyes and regain balance. But Jake gave no quarter, advancing like an enraged bull. Crawford managed to partially recover and drew a hunting knife from his boot. The blade gleamed under the morning sun as he swung it in deadly arcs, trying to open Jake's throat. But the veteran had faced men armed with bayonets in Virginia trenches and knew how to deal with desperate opponents. Jake grabbed Crawford's wrist, twisting it until he heard bones crack. The knife fell to the ground and Crawford screamed in pain and rage. That's when he managed to break free and draw his Colt .45, pointing it directly at Jake's chest. But before he could shoot, Garrett's iron voice echoed across the yard. The sheriff stood at the gate, his own weapon pointed at the assassin's chest. Behind him, 3 deputies newly arrived from the territorial capital held rifles aimed, creating a deadly semicircle around Crawford. Crawford looked around, quickly assessing his options. He was surrounded, wounded, and clearly outnumbered. But instead of surrendering, he laughed with a sound that made crows flee from nearby trees. What happened next lasted less than 3 seconds, but Jake would remember it with crystal clarity for the rest of his life. Crawford moved like a snake, spinning and shooting toward Garrett with impressive speed, but the sheriff was faster and more experienced. His bullet hit Crawford right in the center of his chest, piercing his heart and throwing him back against the tree where Mary was still hanging. The assassin looked down, seeing blood spreading across his white shirt like a red flower blooming. His eyes widened with genuine surprise. For the first time in his violent life, he had encountered someone faster than him. Crawford tried to speak, but only blood came from his mouth. His legs gave way, and he slid down the tree until he was sitting on the ground, his head falling to one side at an unnatural angle. Silas Crawford, the feared Reaper, was dead. While Jake cut the ropes binding Mary, Garrett and his deputies stormed the mansion to arrest Blackwood. But the magnate wasn't there. His servants, too terrified to lie, revealed he had fled during the night, taking 2 horses and several bags full of gold and documents. Garrett spat on the ground in disgust. He had seen many cowards during his career, but few irritated him as much as those who fled, leaving others to face the consequences of their crimes. But Jake wasn't satisfied with just Blackwood's escape. The man had gotten away, but his operations still existed. There were other children, other victims waiting in secret depots scattered throughout the territory, and as long as the network remained intact, new predators would emerge to take Blackwood's place. Interrogating the servants and searching through papers left behind in the rush of escape, Jake and Garrett discovered the full extent of the criminal operation. There were 5 main locations where children were kept before transport: an abandoned warehouse 5 miles north, an isolated cabin near the river, an old mission in the mountains, an apparently legitimate ranch in the adjacent valley, and an underground complex dug into the hills east of town. Each location was guarded by dangerous men, war veterans, or fugitive criminals who wouldn't hesitate to kill to protect their secrets. But Jake and Garrett knew they couldn't wait for reinforcements or higher orders. Each day of delay meant more suffering for innocent children. What followed were 5 days of relentless hunting through the Arizona desert. Jake and Garrett, accompanied by the 3 deputies and 2 town volunteers, attacked each hideout in Blackwood's network with military precision and unwavering determination. The first target was the warehouse to the north. They arrived before dawn, using darkness as cover. The location was guarded by 4 armed men who slept in shifts, confident that their remote location protected them from discovery. Jake and Garrett approached silently, using infiltration techniques they had learned in their respective military careers. They managed to neutralize 2 guards without making noise, but the third woke up and sounded the alarm before they could reach him. The gunfight that followed was brief but intense. The criminals fought desperately, knowing capture meant certain hanging, but they were outnumbered and outpositioned, and within 15 minutes all were dead or too wounded to continue fighting. Inside the warehouse, they found 12 girls between 6 and 15 years old, all destined for brothels in the northern territories. The conditions were deplorable. The children were chained in small improvised cells, poorly fed and clearly terrorized. Some had been drugged to keep them docile during transport. The sight of these innocent children in such a state of degradation hardened Jake's determination even further. Each tear, each frightened look, each fragile body marked by abuse was a silent accusation against all the men who had allowed such horror to continue. The second hideout, the river cabin, proved even more challenging. It was located on a small island in the middle of a fast river, accessible only by a narrow bridge that could be easily defended. The guards had seen the group approaching and prepared for a siege. Garrett suggested waiting until night to attempt a surprise attack, but Jake was impatient. Each hour of delay meant more suffering for the children trapped inside the cabin. He offered to swim to the island and attack from behind, while the others created a distraction in front. The water was cold as mountain ice, and the current was strong enough to drag an unwary man to the rocks downstream. But Jake had crossed rivers under enemy fire during the war and knew how to use the current to his advantage. He emerged from the water behind the cabin like a wet ghost, his Colt still functioning perfectly despite the immersion. The guards were focused on the bridge, expecting a frontal attack, and didn't notice his presence until it was too late. Jake eliminated 2 guards silently before the others understood what was happening. The resulting gunfight was confused and chaotic, with bullets ricocheting off the cabin's wooden walls and splinters flying in all directions. When the smoke cleared, they found 8 boys between 8 and 14 years old who were forced to work in Blackwood's illegal mines. Their hands were calloused and bloody, their bodies too thin for their ages. Some could barely stand after months of forced labor and inadequate nutrition. The third hideout, the old mission in the mountains, would be the most dangerous of all. Blackwood had chosen the location strategically. It was easily defensible, with only one access road that could be watched for miles. Worse still, intelligence gathered from previous prisoners revealed that Blackwood himself had returned to destroy evidence and eliminate witnesses. The mission had been abandoned by Franciscan priests 20 years earlier, when Apache attacks became too frequent to maintain a safe religious presence. Now its stone walls and bell towers served as a fortress for the territory's worst criminals. Jake and Garrett knew a frontal attack would be suicide. Instead, they spent 2 days studying the location, mapping defenses, and looking for weak points. They discovered there was an underground passage connecting the mission to a natural cave in nearby rocks, probably used by the priests as an escape route during Indian attacks. The infiltration through the cave was claustrophobic and dangerous. The tunnel was narrow and partially collapsed, forcing them to crawl for long stretches in total darkness. Jake fought against war memories when he had been forced to hide in similar tunnels while Confederate artillery exploded above his head. They emerged in the mission's basement, where they found even more disturbing evidence of Blackwood's crimes. There was an improvised torture chamber, complete with medieval instruments used to break the resistance of reluctant victims. Scattered documents revealed plans to expand the operation to Mexico and Canada, but it was on the upper floor that they found Blackwood in person. The magnate was at what had been the mission's altar, pouring kerosene on wooden walls and preparing to burn alive the 15 children locked in what had been the sacristy. His appearance had changed dramatically since his escape. The well-dressed and confident man had been replaced by a wild figure with dirty clothes and eyes that gleamed with madness. When he saw Jake and Garrett emerge from the shadows, Blackwood showed no surprise. Instead, he smiled with an expression that chilled both men's blood. It was the smile of someone who had completely lost his sanity and had nothing left to lose. Blackwood revealed he had prepared an ambush. 12 veteran gunfighters were hidden in the mission ruins, all desperate men who would rather die fighting than face the gallows. He had used the children as bait, knowing Jake and Garrett couldn't resist trying to save them. The gunfight that followed was like a symphony from hell. Bullets ricocheted off ancient stone walls, creating sparks that illuminated the tense faces of combatants like strobe lightning. Jake rolled behind a worm-eaten wooden bench, using it as protection while exchanging shots with 3 men simultaneously. Garrett took advantage of the confusion to run toward the sacristy where the children were trapped. 2 gunfighters tried to intercept him, but the sheriff was quick as lightning and precise as a Swiss clockmaker. His bullets found their targets with lethal efficiency. The battle lasted almost an hour, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. Jake was grazed on his left arm, but continued fighting with unwavering determination. One of the deputies was killed by a shot to the head, and another was seriously wounded when a bullet shattered his leg. But gradually, Jake and Garrett's superior experience and determination began to prevail. One by one, Blackwood's gunfighters fell, until only the magnate himself remained alive among the defenders. Blackwood was leaning against the wall where the altar had been, a bloodstain spreading across his white shirt. A stray bullet had found its target, piercing his left lung, but even mortally wounded, his eyes still gleamed with malice. Jake walked slowly toward the wounded man, his Colt still smoking in his hand. Each step echoed in the mission ruins like a funeral bell. When he got close enough to see Blackwood's face clearly, he was shocked by what he saw. The magnate was laughing. Even knowing he was going to die, even seeing his criminal operation crumble around him, Ezra Blackwood was laughing as if he had heard the funniest joke in the world. Blackwood revealed his final card. He had sent telegrams to contacts in Denver, San Francisco, and Chicago before returning to the mission. Other men, as cruel and greedy as himself, were already on their way to take control of the operation. The network was larger than Jake had imagined, with tentacles extending across the entire continent. Even more disturbing, Blackwood claimed there were powerful people in the federal government who protected the operation in exchange for a percentage of the profits. Senators, judges, even some army generals were involved in the conspiracy. Killing Blackwood would only be cutting off one head of the Hydra. Jake knelt beside the dying man, looking directly into his eyes as life slowly drained away. Blackwood tried to speak more, but only blood came from his mouth. His last words were an almost inaudible whisper about revenge and consequences. Ezra Blackwood died with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling of the old mission, as if he could see something the others couldn't. Jake closed the dead man's eyes, not out of respect, but because he couldn't bear to look at that frozen expression of malice any longer. While Garrett freed the children from the sacristy, Jake searched through the papers Blackwood had tried to destroy. What he found confirmed his worst fears. The operation was truly international, with connections reaching Europe and Asia. There were lists of wealthy clients who paid fortunes for specific children, detailed descriptions of transport methods, and even illustrated catalogs treating human beings as merchandise. But there was also something that gave Jake hope. Among the documents, he found evidence of dissent within the organization itself. Some members were becoming uncomfortable with the more extreme aspects of the operation and were considering distancing themselves. There were also indications that honest federal authorities were beginning to investigate, despite efforts to cover up the case. 3 weeks later, Jake was again on his porch watching the streets of Redemption Creek. But now it was different. Children ran freely, laughing and playing as children should. Mary Sullivan was among them, her wounds healed and a genuine smile illuminating her angelic face. The transformation of the town had been remarkable. With Blackwood dead and his operation dismantled, the fear that had hung over Redemption Creek like a black cloud finally dissipated. Families who had fled began to return. New businesses opened. The silver mine was taken over by a miners' cooperative that guaranteed fair wages and safe working conditions. Garrett had decided to stay as the town's permanent sheriff. He had found something in Redemption Creek that he had lost during his years in Tombstone. The feeling that his work truly made a difference. It wasn't just about keeping the peace. It was about protecting innocent people and building something better. Jake had also found his place. He accepted Garrett's offer to become a deputy, a position that allowed him to use his skills to protect the community he had learned to love. For the first time since the war, he felt his life had purpose and meaning. But peace in the West never lasts long. Jake knew other predators would eventually arrive, attracted by the town's renewed prosperity. Human nature didn't change, and there would always be those willing to exploit the weak and innocent. That's when Vincent Carver arrived in town. Carver appeared on a November afternoon, mounted on a horse black as the darkest night. His clothes were expensive and well cut, but there was something about them that suggested contained violence. He moved with the predatory grace of a feline, each gesture calculated and controlled. Jake saw him first from the sheriff's office window, where he was organizing reports on the ongoing federal investigation. Something about the stranger made him stop and pay attention. Perhaps it was the way he observed the town, as if evaluating defenses and looking for weak points. Carver went directly to the saloon and asked for Jake Morrison. His voice was smooth and polite, but there was a quality to it that made men instinctively step back. It was the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. When Jake appeared, Carver greeted him as if they were old friends. He explained he had been Blackwood's business partner and had come to collect an outstanding debt. His story was carefully constructed and technically legal, but Jake immediately recognized the lies behind the polite words. Carver claimed Blackwood owed him $50,000, an astronomical sum that not even the entire town together possessed. He showed documents that appeared authentic, but which Jake knew were elaborate forgeries. Carver's true purpose wasn't to collect money. It was to take control of the operation Blackwood had built. Jake tried to dismiss Carver politely, but the man made it clear he wouldn't accept refusal. His threats were veiled but unequivocal. If he couldn't get what he wanted through legal means, he would use other methods, and those methods would involve the people Jake cared most about protecting. The tension in town increased dramatically with Carver's presence. He rented the best room in the local hotel and began asking questions about Blackwood's previous operation. He offered generous money for information, trying to reconstruct the criminal network Jake and Garrett had worked so hard to destroy. Worse still, Carver wasn't alone. Over the following days, other men began arriving discreetly in town. They were all hardened veterans with cold eyes and hands that never strayed far from their weapons. Jake recognized the type: professional assassins and career criminals who would kill anyone for enough money. Garrett tried to use his legal authority to expel Carver and his men, but the criminal had prepared carefully. All his documents were in order, and he hadn't technically committed any crime in Redemption Creek. His threats were always implicit, never direct enough to justify arrest. The situation reached a breaking point when Mary Sullivan disappeared. Jake had gone out on a routine patrol when he received the news. The girl had last been seen playing near the school, but when the teacher went to look for her for dinner, she had simply vanished. There were no signs of struggle, no clues about what had happened, but Jake knew exactly who was responsible. Carver had kidnapped Mary to force him to cooperate. It was a classic blackmail tactic, using the most innocent and vulnerable person as leverage to get what he wanted. When Jake confronted Carver at the hotel, the criminal denied any involvement with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He suggested that perhaps the girl had simply gotten lost in the hills around town. Accidents happened, especially with children who didn't pay attention to the dangers of the desert. The message was clear: cooperate or the girl would die. Jake felt the same fury he had experienced during the war, when he saw Confederate soldiers executing wounded prisoners. It was a cold, calculated rage that burned like ice in his veins. Carver had made a fatal mistake by threatening Mary. He had made it personal. That night, Jake and Garrett met secretly to plan a rescue. They knew Carver was keeping Mary somewhere outside town, probably guarded by several of his men. A direct attack would be too risky. The girl could be killed before they could reach her. Instead, Jake proposed a more subtle strategy. He would pretend to accept Carver's demands and offer to show him the secret hideouts of Blackwood's former operation. Once he managed to separate Carver from his men, he could force him to reveal Mary's location. It was a dangerous plan that depended on perfect timing and considerable luck. But Jake was willing to risk everything to save the girl who had become like a daughter to him. The meeting was set for dawn at the ruins of the old mission. Jake arrived alone, as agreed, but knew that Garrett and 2 deputies were hidden in nearby rocks, ready to intervene if necessary. Carver appeared punctually, accompanied by only 2 of his men. He seemed confident and relaxed, as if he had already won. But Jake noticed his eyes never stopped moving, always alert for possible threats. Jake began showing the hideouts, explaining how Blackwood had operated and where profits were stored. Carver listened attentively, asking detailed questions that revealed considerable knowledge about similar criminal operations. It was when they reached the 3rd hideout that Jake made his move. He pretended to stumble and fall, and when Carver leaned down to help him, Jake grabbed his weapon and turned it on the 2 henchmen. The element of surprise gave him the advantage he needed. Carver tried to draw his own weapon, but Jake was faster. In seconds, he had the barrel of his Colt pressed against the criminal's temple, while the 2 henchmen lay dead in the dust. Under threat of immediate death, Carver revealed that Mary was being held in an abandoned cabin 10 miles south. 2 of his men were guarding her, with orders to kill her if he didn't return by noon. Jake forced Carver to accompany him to the cabin, using him as a human shield in case there was an ambush. The ride through the desert was tense, with Jake constantly watching for signs of betrayal. The cabin was exactly where Carver had said, hidden in a narrow canyon that offered natural protection from observation. Jake could see 2 armed men patrolling outside, confirming that Mary was really there. The rescue was quick and brutal. Jake used Carver as a distraction, forcing him to walk to the cabin while he approached from behind. When the guards focused on their boss, Jake attacked with the speed and precision of a snake. Both guards were dead before they fully understood what was happening. Jake found Mary tied and gagged inside the cabin, terrified but physically unharmed. The girl threw herself into his arms, crying with relief and fear. Carver tried to flee during the confusion, but Jake caught him before he could mount his horse. The final confrontation was brief but decisive. Carver was skilled, but Jake fought with the fury of a father protecting his daughter. When it was all over, Vincent Carver lay dead in the canyon dust, and Mary was safe in Jake's arms. But both knew this was just the beginning. Carver had mentioned others who would come, a larger network of criminals who wouldn't give up easily. Back in Redemption Creek, Jake and Garrett prepared for what they knew would come next. The town had become a symbol of resistance against corruption, and that would inevitably attract more predators. But it had also attracted the attention of good people, honest federal investigators, social reformers, and others who wanted to help in the fight against organized crime. In the months that followed, Redemption Creek became a beacon of hope in the Wild West. Jake and Garrett worked tirelessly to strengthen the town's defenses and train a new generation of law defenders. They established connections with honest authorities in other cities, creating a communication network that allowed tracking criminals on the move. Mary Sullivan grew strong and healthy, eventually becoming a teacher at the local school. She never forgot the man who had risked everything to save her, and Jake never forgot the girl who had given new purpose to his life. The fight against organized crime continued for years, with victories and defeats on both sides. But Redemption Creek remained free, a testament to what brave men and women could achieve when they united against injustice. Jake Morrison had found his redemption in the dusty streets of a small Arizona town. He had learned that sometimes justice comes at gunpoint, but true victory lies in building something better for future generations. And as the sun set over distant mountains, painting the sky red and gold, Jake knew he had done the right thing. It wasn't always easy, it wasn't always clean, but it was just. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The peace he had helped build in Redemption Creek would spread, inspiring other communities to resist corruption and fight for a better future. Jake Morrison's legacy wouldn't be measured only by the lives he had saved, but by the lives that would be saved by those who followed his example. Because in the Wild West, as anywhere, the difference between civilization and barbarism often depended on the courage of a few individuals willing to do what was right, regardless of personal cost. And Jake Morrison had proven that even an ordinary man, marked by the scars of war and loss, could become a hero when circumstances demanded it. His story would become legend, told around campfires and in saloons throughout the territory, inspiring others to follow his example. But for Jake, the true reward wasn't in fame or recognition. It was in Mary's smile when she ran to greet him every morning, in the silent respect of men who passed him on the street, and in the certainty that he had made a difference in the world. 5 years after Carver's death, Jake was sitting on his porch watching the town's activity when a familiar-looking young man approached. The boy was about 20 years old, tall and thin, with determined eyes that reminded Jake of himself in his youth. The young man introduced himself as Thomas Sullivan, Mary's older brother. He had been working in the California gold mines when his family died, and only learned of the tragedy months later. Now he had returned to personally thank the man who had saved his sister and given her a new chance at life. Thomas brought disturbing news from the outside world. The criminal network Blackwood had built hadn't died with him. Other men had taken control, adapting and expanding operations. Now they called themselves the Company and operated as a quasi-military organization with cells in dozens of cities throughout the West. Worse still, Thomas had discovered that the company had placed a bounty on Jake Morrison's head, $50,000 for whoever brought his head, dead or alive. It was an amount that would attract bounty hunters from across the continent. Jake received the news with outward calm, but inside he felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He had hoped the problems of the past would remain buried, but he knew men like Blackwood left poisonous seeds that could sprout years later. Garrett, now with completely gray hair but still agile as a man half his age, joined the conversation. The sheriff had received similar reports through his contacts in other cities. The company was preparing for something big, recruiting desperate men and accumulating weapons in secret depots. That night, the three men gathered at Jake's house to discuss the situation. Mary, now a 23-year-old woman, insisted on participating in the conversation. She had become one of the most respected people in town, not only for her education, but for her courage and determination. Mary revealed she had been conducting her own investigation into the company through correspondence with other teachers in distant cities. Many had reported the disappearance of children, always followed by the arrival of well-dressed men who asked questions and offered money for information. The network was more sophisticated now, using legitimate businesses as fronts and corrupting local authorities in more subtle ways. But the objective remained the same: to profit from human suffering through any means necessary. Jake understood that confronting the company would be different from his previous confrontations. It wouldn't be a matter of a few armed men who could be defeated in direct gunfights. This was an organization with resources, influence, and patience to plan complex operations. Thomas offered his help, revealing he had learned valuable skills during his years in the mines. He knew how to use explosives, how to move silently through difficult terrain, and how to survive in adverse conditions. More importantly, he was motivated by a thirst for justice that rivaled Jake's. Garrett suggested they contact honest federal investigators who had been working to expose the company. There was a special agent named William Hayes who had dedicated his career to fighting organized crime in the West. Perhaps it was time to transform the local struggle into a national campaign. But before they could implement any plan, the company made the first move. One spring morning, Jake woke to the sound of horses approaching rapidly. He looked out the window and saw a sight that chilled his blood. A dozen armed men surrounding his house, all wearing dark clothes and masks covering their faces. Jake grabbed his Colt and quickly checked his ammunition. He had enough bullets for a fight, but knew he was at a clear numerical disadvantage. He needed to buy time until Garrett and the others could arrive to help. The leader of the attackers shouted a demand for Jake to surrender. He promised he would be treated with honor if he cooperated, but threatened to burn the house down with him inside if he resisted. The voice was polite and civilized, but there was a coldness in it that revealed the man's true nature. Jake responded with a shot that brought down the man closest to his porch. The battle began immediately, with bullets flying in all directions. Jake used his house's furniture as protection, constantly moving to prevent the attackers from getting a clear aim. The wooden house didn't offer much protection against rifle bullets, and soon Jake could hear projectiles piercing the walls around him. Wood splinters flew like miniature grenades, cutting his skin and forcing him to keep his head down. That's when he heard the most beautiful sound in the world: the war cries of Garrett and his deputies arriving at a gallop. The sheriff had heard the shots and gathered all available men for a quick response. The gunfight that followed transformed the peaceful street into a battlefield. Residents ran for shelter while bullets ricocheted off walls and windows. The air filled with gunpowder smoke and the screams of wounded men. Gradually, Jake and Garrett's experience and local knowledge began to prevail. The attackers were skilled, but they were fighting on unfamiliar territory against men who knew every alley and every rooftop in town. When the smoke finally cleared, 8 of the attackers were dead and the other 4 had fled wounded. Jake had been hit in the shoulder, but the wound was superficial. Garrett had a deep cut on his forehead, where a bullet had passed very close. Among the dead, they found evidence that confirmed their worst suspicions. The men carried enough money for several months of operation, military-quality weapons, and coded documents suggesting an organization much larger than they had imagined. Even more disturbing, one of the surviving attackers revealed under interrogation that the attack had been just a distraction. While Jake fought for his life, other members of the company had kidnapped 3 children from the local school, including 2 of Mary's favorite students. The revelation hit Jake like a punch to the stomach. Once again, his personal fight had put innocents in danger. The company was using the same tactics Blackwood had employed, but on a much larger scale. The captured kidnapper provided limited information about where the children were being held. He spoke of a fortified complex in the mountains, guarded by dozens of armed men and designed to withstand prolonged attacks. It was the company's regional headquarters, where they planned their operations and kept their most valuable prisoners. Jake knew a direct attack on the complex would be suicide, but he also knew he couldn't abandon the children to the fate the company had planned for them. He needed a plan that used intelligence instead of brute force. It was Mary who suggested the solution. As a teacher, she had contacts in schools throughout the territory. She could organize a network of informants that would track the company's movements and identify their weak points. Women and children were often ignored by criminals who underestimated their capacity for observation and communication. Thomas offered to use his explosive skills to create diversions that would divide the company's forces. If they could force the organization to defend multiple targets simultaneously, they could create opportunities to rescue the prisoners. Garrett finally suggested contacting Federal Agent Hayes. The situation had escalated beyond the capacity of local authorities, and they needed federal resources to combat an organization of the company's size and sophistication. In the days that followed, Redemption Creek transformed into a military operations center. Hayes arrived with a team of experienced federal agents, bringing modern weapons and communication equipment that would allow coordinating attacks at multiple locations. The investigation revealed that the company had grown far beyond its origins as a human trafficking network. Now it was involved in arms smuggling, counterfeiting, large-scale cattle rustling, and even espionage for foreign powers interested in destabilizing American territories. Even more shocking, they discovered that the company had infiltrated agents into positions of authority in Washington, D.C. Senators, judges, and military officers were on the organization's payroll, providing political protection in exchange for a percentage of the profits. Hayes explained that the federal government had been investigating the company for more than 2 years, but corruption at high levels had repeatedly sabotaged their efforts. The attack on Jake had been a tactical error that finally gave honest authorities the legal justification they needed for decisive action. The plan they developed was ambitious and dangerous. They would simultaneously attack 5 company installations in 3 states, using information collected by Mary's network and the specialized skills of each team member. Jake would lead the attack on the mountain complex where the children were being held. It was the most dangerous mission, but also the most important. Thomas would accompany him, using explosives to create breaches in the defenses and eliminate resistance points. Garrett would command an attack on a weapons depot in the adjacent valley, preventing the company from reinforcing their other positions. Hayes would lead coordinated attacks on organization offices in 2 nearby cities, collecting evidence and arresting local leaders. Mary would coordinate communications from Redemption Creek, using her network of contacts to provide real-time intelligence and warn about enemy movements. It was a crucial role that required considerable courage, since the company would certainly try to silence her if they discovered her importance. The operation was scheduled to begin at dawn on a Tuesday, when most company members would be sleeping or with their guard down. Jake spent the previous night checking and rechecking his equipment, cleaning his weapons, and mentally rehearsing every aspect of the plan. When the sun rose over the Arizona mountains, Jake Morrison rode toward what he knew could be his last battle. But this time he wasn't fighting just for revenge or personal justice. He was fighting for the future of all innocent children the company threatened, and for the idea that good could triumph over evil when brave people united for a just cause. The final battle would be epic, but Jake was ready. He had found his redemption in Redemption Creek, and now was prepared to defend it with his life if necessary. Because some things were worth more than individual life: freedom, justice, and the right of children to grow up without fear. And as he rode toward the distant mountains, Jake Morrison knew that regardless of what happened, he had lived a life that mattered. He had made a difference in the world. One child, one family, one town at a time. That was all any man could hope for. And for Jake Morrison, it was more than enough. The mountain complex was even more impressive than Jake had imagined. Built in a series of natural caves connected by hand-dug tunnels, it looked like a medieval fortress adapted for the modern era. Watchtowers projected from the rocks like stone teeth, and Jake could see at least a dozen guards patrolling the improvised ramparts. Thomas studied the defenses through binoculars, mentally mapping where to place explosive charges for maximum effect. His experience in the mines had taught him exactly how rock behaved under pressure, and he knew he could use the mountain itself as a weapon against the company. The attack began with a deafening explosion that made the entire mountain tremble. Thomas had detonated strategically placed charges that blocked the 2 main escape routes, effectively trapping the criminals in their own fortress. The message was clear: there would be no retreat this time. Jake took advantage of the confusion to infiltrate the complex through a fissure in the rock that Thomas had widened with a smaller charge. The interior was a labyrinth of poorly lit tunnels, but Jake followed the sounds of frightened voices until he found where the children were being held. What he saw when he reached the main chamber almost made him vomit with rage. It wasn't just 3 children. There were more than 20, aged between 5 and 15, chained like animals in improvised cages. Some were clearly sick, others wounded, all terrorized beyond the capacity for expression. But it was when Jake saw the man responsible for that atrocity that he felt a fury surpassing anything he had experienced before. The company's leader was a middle-aged man with respectable appearance, wearing an expensive suit and speaking with an educated Eastern accent. He looked more like a banker or politician than a monster, which made him even more repugnant. The man introduced himself as Colonel Augustus Whitmore, a former army officer who had deserted during the war to form his own criminal organization. He spoke about the children as if they were investments, discussing their market values and profit potential with the coldness of a cattle trader. Whitmore showed no fear when he saw Jake emerge from the shadows with weapon in hand. Instead, he smiled with the confidence of someone who had always managed to get out of difficult situations through manipulation and bribery. He offered Jake a partnership, promising riches beyond imagination if he joined the organization. Jake responded with a shot that passed inches from Whitmore's head, shattering a lantern behind him and plunging part of the cave into darkness. The colonel finally understood he was dealing with a man who couldn't be bought or intimidated. The gunfight that followed was unlike anything Jake had experienced before. The caves amplified every sound, creating echoes that made it impossible to determine where shots were coming from. The partial darkness transformed every shadow into a potential threat. But Jake had an advantage the criminals didn't possess. He was fighting for something greater than himself. Each terrified child he saw gave him renewed strength. Each tear he wiped away fed his determination to end that monstrosity once and for all. Thomas arrived with reinforcements at the crucial moment when Jake was cornered by 3 armed men in a narrow tunnel. Young Sullivan fought like a demon, using mining knives and small explosive charges to clear the way. His fury for the sister he had almost lost years before finally found a productive outlet. Gradually, Jake and Thomas managed to eliminate organized resistance. The criminals, accustomed to intimidating defenseless victims, weren't prepared to face determined men fighting for justice. One by one, they fell until only Whitmore remained alive. The colonel had barricaded himself in the complex's deepest chamber, using the remaining children as human shields. His demands were simple: safe passage out of the country in exchange for the prisoners' lives. It was the last card of a desperate man who finally understood his empire was crumbling. Jake knew he couldn't risk the children's lives in a direct attack. Instead, he used his military experience to create a distraction. He pretended to accept Whitmore's demands, offering to personally escort him to the Mexican border. But when Whitmore lowered his guard for a moment, Jake acted with the speed of a snake. He leaped on the criminal, knocking him to the ground and fighting for control of his weapon. The struggle was brief but intense. 2 men hardened by violence testing their skills in mortal combat. Jake prevailed, but not without cost. Whitmore had managed to wound him severely in the abdomen before dying, and Jake could feel his strength draining rapidly. But there was work to do before he could rest. With Thomas's help, Jake freed all the children and led them out of the ruined complex. Each child saved was a victory against the forces of darkness, proof that good could triumph when brave men were willing to sacrifice everything for justice. News of the other attacks arrived by telegraph. While Jake received medical treatment in Redemption Creek, Garrett had captured the weapons depot without losing a single man, seizing enough arsenal to equip a small army. Hayes had arrested dozens of company members and collected evidence that would lead to the downfall of corrupt politicians in Washington. More importantly, Mary's communication network had worked perfectly. Teachers in 10 different cities had provided information that allowed federal authorities to dismantle company cells throughout the territory. The organization that had seemed invincible was unraveling like a house of cards. In the months that followed, the trials of captured company members became a national sensation. Newspapers from New York to San Francisco published stories about the courage of Redemption Creek's defenders and the determination of ordinary men to confront organized evil. Jake became a national hero, but he rejected offers for books, lectures, and even a position in the federal government. His reward was in seeing the children he had saved grow healthy and happy, free from the fear that had dominated their lives. Mary Sullivan married Thomas, creating a family that became a pillar of the Redemption Creek community. She continued teaching, but now her classes included stories about courage, justice, and the importance of defending the weak against the powerful. Garrett remained as sheriff until his hair turned completely white, training a new generation of law defenders who carried his methods and principles to other cities throughout the West. His reputation for honesty and courage spread, inspiring others to follow his example. Jake built a larger house on the hill overlooking Redemption Creek, where he could watch the town he had helped save. He officially adopted 3 of the orphan children he had rescued, giving them the love and stability they had lost. His house became a refuge for any child who needed protection, but perhaps the greatest victory was Redemption Creek's transformation into a symbol of hope. Families from across the country moved there, attracted by the promise of a community where justice prevailed and innocents were protected. The town grew and prospered, but never lost the values Jake and his companions had defended with their lives. Years later, when Jake was an elderly man with white hair and trembling hands, he still sat on his porch every afternoon to watch children play in the streets. Each laugh, each smile, each moment of innocent joy was proof that his struggle had been worthwhile. One afternoon, a young journalist from a major Eastern newspaper came to interview him about his life and the legendary battles against the company. She asked what had been the most important moment of his entire journey. Jake thought for a long moment, watching Mary, now a mature woman with children of her own, teaching a group of children under the shade of a large tree. Finally, he smiled and answered. The most important moment hadn't been any of the gunfights or dramatic confrontations. It had been that first day, when he decided to help a little girl with a water bucket too heavy for her to carry, because it was in that moment he understood that every action, however small, can change the course of history. The journalist wrote his story, and it was published in newspapers across the country. But for Jake, the true reward wasn't in fame or recognition. It was in the certainty that he had lived a life that mattered, that he had made a difference in the world when it mattered most. When Jake Morrison died peacefully in his bed at 82 years old, the entire town of Redemption Creek attended his funeral. Men he had inspired, women he had protected, children he had saved, all came to pay their final respects to the man who had proven that a brave individual can change the world. They erected a statue in his honor in the town's main square, but the true tribute was in the lives he had touched. Every child who grew up free from fear, every family who found safety in Redemption Creek, every person who was inspired by his courage to defend what is right, all were part of his eternal legacy. Jake Morrison's story spread beyond Arizona's borders, becoming a legend that inspired generations of Americans. Books were written, movies were made, but none could completely capture the essence of the man who had transformed a corrupt town into a beacon of hope. Because the true magic of Jake's story wasn't in the gunfights or dramatic confrontations. It was in the proof that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when motivated by love, justice, and unwavering determination to protect the innocent. Redemption Creek prospered for decades after Jake's death, always remembering the principles he had defended. The town became a pilgrimage destination for those seeking inspiration, living proof that good can triumph over evil when brave people unite for a just cause. And on clear desert nights, when the wind blows through the town's streets, the oldest residents swear they can still hear the echo of Jake Morrison's footsteps, eternally watching over the community he loved and protected until his last breath. His story continues inspiring new generations of heroes, ordinary men and women, who discover extraordinary courage when confronted with injustice. Because Jake Morrison proved you don't need to be perfect to be heroic, you just need a heart big enough to care and courage enough to act. And that's a lesson that resonates through time, reminding us that each of us has the power to be the hero in someone else's story. All we need is the courage to take the first step, as Jake did that distant day when he decided to help a little girl with a bucket too heavy for her to carry. Because sometimes, the greatest heroes are those who simply refuse to pass by injustices without acting. And Jake Morrison will always be remembered as proof that an ordinary man, armed only with courage and determination, can change the world for the better. His story ends, but his legacy is eternal. And somewhere in a small town that was once called Redemption Creek, children still play freely in the streets, protected by the spirit of a man who proved that love is stronger than hate, justice more powerful than corruption, and hope more enduring than despair. This is the story of Jake Morrison, the man who found his redemption by saving others, and who taught us that we all have the power to be heroes when it matters most.